Welcome to Gay Men Going Deeper, a podcast by the Gay Men's Brotherhood where we talk about personal development, mental health, and sexuality. Today, I'm your host. My name is Michael Pezzullo. I'm a life and wellness coach specializing in sexuality, relationships, and self-confidence. Today, we're discussing a very important and often challenging topic, sexual abuse. This is a subject that affects many within our community, and yet it remains shrouded in a lot of silence and stigma. So, on this podcast, for those of you who've been listening, you know that we believe it's crucial to bring these conversations into the open because it does help to reduce the stigma, reduce the shame, and take important steps towards healing. Joining me today is Michael Pezzullo, a licensed marriage and family therapist located in West Hollywood, California. In his practice, Michael works extensively with the LGBTQIA+ community with a specific focus on gay men. Michael, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so I want to start off with a shocking statistic that I found when I was researching this episode. And this is from a study by the Williams Institute at UCLA School of Law. And it says that LGBT people are nearly 4 times more likely than non-LGBT people to experience violent victimization, including rape and sexual assault. Additionally, LGBT individuals are at a higher risk of experiencing abuse, both from people they know and from strangers. And one of the most shocking things of all is that about half of all victimizations are not reported to the police. So this is a big deal. And again, the source here is the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law. So remember that when we're talking about abuse, it could happen in childhood or adulthood. And in this episode, we're going to be covering both, any and all. And either way, regardless, it can be very challenging for a lot of guys out there to disclose that they have been abused, which prevents them from getting the help that they need. So, I know that this is a more serious subject, but as we said, it's important that we talk about it. For those of you who might be triggered by this, please do pause if you do need to come back and you can listen to it again. We will do our best here to make sure that we have you covered. And Michael will put your show notes or put your information in the show notes as well in case people do want to contact you. Okay, Michael, it's your first time on our podcast. Welcome to Gay Men
Yes.
Going Deeper. So why don't you introduce yourself to the audience and then maybe let us know a little bit about why you wanted to talk about this topic specifically.
Yeah. So like you said, I'm a psychotherapist. I work in private practice. I'm here in West Hollywood. That's where I am right now. Um, I've been doing this. I've been doing my own practice for 5 years. Before that, I've worked in a bunch of different treatment facilities, addiction treatment, dual diagnosis treatment, residential levels of care, outpatient, PHP, all the different types, detox, you name it. I've worked with different populations. I've worked in sex addiction, with adolescents. I've worked with older people. I mean, you name it. I've done different groups. But the intersection I ended up with for a while was LGBTQ addiction in particular. And what you see with that is a lot of trauma that follows underneath it. And so, like you said, in my practice now, I'm pretty heavily LGBT, although it's mostly the G. It's mostly gay men. And with that, I do a lot of trauma work as well. Trauma therapy covers a lot of different modalities. There's a traditional talk therapy type. There's like a more cognitive behavioral type. And now we're seeing a lot more like somatic therapies, EMDR, ketamine-assisted therapy, and I do all of those.
Yeah, very interesting. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about some of those and what those mean and how they could help as we get into the podcast. The first question I had when I was looking at this topic was, what exactly is sexual abuse? We hear that a lot. And I was like, well, what does that mean exactly? So let's start there for our audience out there who might not know exactly what we're talking about. Can you give some examples? What is the exact definition?
Yeah. So I mean, there's, I think with everything, and if with trauma too, there's always going to be different definitions and different paradigms that people follow, and you can go with what works for you, and you can think of multiple and see what appeals to you. When I think of abuse, I think of violating someone's consent. And consent is also can be a moving target, as we know in any kind of sexual interaction. You're saying yes or no every step of the way. And a lot of that is nonverbal, some of that is verbal, some of it's a little bit of both. But I think it's pretty clear when you're having an interaction with someone that you're able to track that with the other person. And if there's ever a moment where that has been ignored or pushed past, then I think that's abuse.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I can think of my own personal examples where I've been in hookups where it was a no, and he really, really tried very hard to
Mm-hmm.
persuade me.
Yep.
I mean, and I can imagine somebody who just has a hard time saying no, or just kind of, I hear about this all the time. They kind of just eventually just give in, say, "Oh, forget it. I guess I'll just do it."
Yes, and that's something that you can really work with people on in therapy, and I'm sure in coaching too, is um, having boundaries and then upholding boundaries. And I heard this once, but I think it's so important is that holding boundaries, you have to be relentless when you do that. I think that we have this idea in my head of I'm going to craft my boundary, I'm going to say it one time, and then I'm just going to leave it there and everyone's going to respect it. And a lot of people will, but there are people who won't. And it is, I do think it is our job to really relentlessly guard our boundaries.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I mean, who else is going to do it if not you, right? Yeah.
Yep.
So let's go back to some examples here. I mean, I know that you're not a statistician, but just based on what you see in your own practice, like what are some common areas that you see specifically with gay men? Where does this come up, the sexual abuse?
So there's a few different ways. And statistics, I've only taken one statistics class, and the most important thing that I learned is that statistics are mostly garbage. But with this topic, if I had to guess, I would say that whatever the statistics say, that the truth is worse, is would be my general guess. But um I what I would say too is when you think about sexual abuse, is that you do want to separate it into abuse that occurred in childhood and then in adulthood. Anything that occurred in childhood, excuse me, is going to be much more toxic and malignant. I mean, abuse in general that occurs at that age is going to be much worse. But that's something you're going to really want to highlight and go into. And what I'll just say is that from my own anecdotal experience as a therapist, I hear about these instances much more frequently from gay men than from straight men.
Why do you think that is?
I think there's a couple of reasons, and they're kind of tough to think about, but I think it's important that we go into it. But so I think a lot of gay boys are molested as children. I think the reason is that predators are um, looking for boys that may indicate some sort of sexuality that's not completely straight. And then, again, like they're so young, there's no way to know for sure. But I think that's like a tell that they're going toward.
Yep.
So I think that's probably the most likely reason if I had to guess.
Yeah. So it's like an easy target for a predator. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting.
And also someone who won't speak up.
What about in the adult situation? So what are some scenarios that comes up where people are abused as adults?
Yeah, so it's interesting. If I think of gay men in particular, right? I think that where this gets very mucky is when it comes to like the more hookup culture and
Yeah.
apps and stuff,
Yeah.
where you are, and this is the same, I mean, they've been saying this to straight women for years, but when you are knowingly putting yourself into a sort of risky situation and in a sexual situation by choice, right? But that doesn't mean that you're consenting to anything that happens to you once you get there. But I think that, there used to be a day and age where like you wouldn't just go home with some random person that you didn't know because you were worried about what might happen. But now we do live in this culture where you just pick up your phone and you follow the map, and the next thing you know, you're at someone's house, which is fine and it's all good and well, but it is a little dangerous, I think,
Mhm.
more than we remember.
Mhm.
And anyway, I think the point I'm trying to get to is that I hear stories from guys and from friends too who have purposely gone on a hookup and then something bad happened to them and they feel like they gave consent because they showed up willingly.
Yeah, and I think I've been with guys who, again, just because I walked into the door, that in their mind is like you can just tell that they think they have like some kind of blanket consent. And I can imagine how it can be very hard for people to want to get out of there because you're not in your home, assuming it's not in your home. You're in a place that you don't know, you don't quite know what's going on. And so I can understand how sometimes it's easier to just be like, fuck it, I guess I'll just do this as quick as possible, get it out of the way,
Hmm.
and get me the hell out
Hmm.
of here.
Yep. Yes, agreed. And I do think that there is a difference between I'm like going along with this to get this over with, which I think is crossing a boundary of yourself and
Yeah.
is something that you should look at also. And also, being like abused and violated. Both are unpleasant, but I think that's something that people can discern too.
Yeah. So really what we're talking about here a lot of is boundaries already. We're kind of
Hmm.
seeing that that's a big piece here. So how would you help somebody who has a hard time just setting boundaries in general? And is it fair to say that if you have a hard time setting boundaries in general in your life, that this might be that you might be more, I don't know, prone or inclined to be in
Yes.
some of these situations? Yeah.
Yes. People who struggle with boundaries, you're going to see it across the board. You're going to see it everywhere. It's a learned behavior. It's almost like a learned helplessness of people learn that if I am people pleasing or if I negate my needs, then people seem to like me more.
Hmm.
And there is some truth to that. People that set boundaries, often people are disappointed in them because they're not doing what they want. But there's also a respect there. When you interact with someone who has clear boundaries and a clear sense of self, you know right away who this person is and how like where we can go together or where we can't go together.
Yeah.
And if you're a person with boundaries yourself, you're gonna respect them and feel like I know what to do with you. But people get very passive, they let their boundaries go. And I think the problem is that most people have done that for so long that the task of beginning to assert themselves is very difficult. I think most people, even if they're not stating their boundaries, they know what they are. They have a sense of what feels comfortable and what feels uncomfortable, but the task of using their voice and finding like the courage to be brave, is tough.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've been there. I've been in those situations where it is tough, and yet, that's the point about, I guess, a predator is they will probably seek out those
Yes.
who are maybe what I don't know how they would determine this, but maybe appear like they
Hmm.
will have a hard time speaking up for themselves, and
That's
that
right.
could be like that could be a based on their age, race, social, cultural status. That could be anything, right?
You can smell it on people when they don't have boundaries. You can tell
Mm,
really quick. And I was talking to someone about this recently too, and he was saying how he was asking me, he's like, people are always kind of trying to get poke around and get me to do things. And do people do that to you? And I said, no. Honestly, no one ever tries to cross my boundaries pretty much ever because they can tell that I have them.
yeah,
And people that are looking to do this, they are testing you and then they're seeing who isn't strong in this area and then they're going to like double down.
totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when people show up into your office, do they show up saying, knowing that sexual they have been a victim of sexual abuse, or is it something that they find out over the course of a conversation and then you kind of remind them or you tell them, hey, this is what happened to you. You've been victimized by someone.
I would say actually for the most part people tend to know that they were
Mm.
abused or that something wrong happened to them. The degree of how much they want to go into it or the meaning that they've made of their abuse they've suffered, that's what's very variable and what you want to get to know on an individual basis. But I think most people actually do.
What is the impact of this kind of sexual abuse to someone in their other relationships? And like, let's say you want to have a relationship down the road and you have been abused by someone, that trust has been broken and those boundaries have been violated. How does it impact their future relationships?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's going to be a poor impact for sure. I think um you know I think first and foremost the biggest thing people are left with after sexual abuse is shame,
Yeah.
which is so unfair because it belongs with the other person. It belongs to the person who did the violating thing. But I think that that's what people are left with. And when you're someone who's holding a lot of shame, you're always going to distance yourself from people because you don't like a part of yourself. You don't want people to see that part of you either. So it's going to create a buffer.
Yeah. Not to mention the shame that already might be there, right?
Hmm.
I carry a lot of shame, not because I was abused, but I already have a lot of shame that I had to work through and heal. And just to add more on top of that would be very overwhelming.
Hmm. Yes, and those are factors you look at as a therapist too. When you hear about abuse and trauma sort of as an outsider, sometimes you think of it as like a single narrative, but you when you work with people, you want to think of like what are the layers that are being added onto. And to your point, if it's someone who didn't have a lot of shame to begin with, then that's good. But if they did, it's really going to reinforce a negative narrative.
Yeah. I imagine it would absolutely impact other relationships. Just that trauma of having that happen to you, for me anyway, like it would be very hard for me to trust somebody again. And I wouldn't want to let them in. So again, like holding everyone at arm's length, not letting people in, building walls, not wanting to be vulnerable, wanting to in fact do the opposite of be vulnerable, which is build a big wall and put a big barrier between me and other people.
Yes, I mean, you named it perfectly. Those are all really common things that show up for people after they experience sexual abuse. Yeah.
Yeah. So do they come to you? I guess you've answered that. They come to you knowing that, and what are they looking for help with exactly?
You know what's interesting is that I would say because we live in this day and age where we have more of a open conversation about sexual abuse, child abuse, things like that, which are so important because they've been happening, unfortunately, forever.
Yeah.
This isn't a new thing, but it was, before you would never talk about these things openly. I think because it's more of an open conversation, people do share these things more willingly, and but I think the most important thing is you want to understand how did this affect this person in particular, because it's going to be very, very different in each
Yeah.
case. Um, but overall, the fact that we do bring these things to light is so valuable.
Let's talk about that. Great segue. I was just thinking that. Shame wants us to keep silent, right? So there's all
Hmm.
that shame, which is all the more reason why you don't want to talk to anyone. Let's hope they get into your office, they talk to you, they disclose to you what's happened. What is the value? Like, why is this such an important thing to do? Like, why would someone want to go through all that pain of reliving it, talking about it, you know, all that, face that shame? Like, what's on the other end of it?
So I would say that there is almost always going to be a false belief system that has been absorbed that just is not true. And it may be obvious at the jump when someone tells you a story, you're like, oh, wait, but sometimes you don't notice it until you're going along, but almost always you're going to find it. And when you do, that's where you can really intervene and help someone see that they are thinking about something in a way that actually is not accurate,
Mhm.
and like literally bring them into the light.
Mhm. Yeah. Just
And
like,
you have to be very like confrontational too. When someone is insistent that it's their fault that they were abused, you have to be even more insistent that they weren't. Like you can't really take this passive stance of like, oh, okay, I see your point.
yeah.
Like you have to really, really be clear with them that I don't see the blame for you unless
Yeah.
you can prove me otherwise, but stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes to all that, but especially in the case where it's like a child, like how can anyone
Yes.
possibly justify that they were have any responsibility in that?
The most difficult part of childhood sexual abuse, and this is so important to talk about. I know it's a little bit intense, but almost always, when people think of abuse, they think of you're grabbed and thrown into a room and attacked, right? Children are preyed upon by someone that they like. It's almost always someone that they really like, who's older, who's interesting, who maybe they're attracted to, or whatever it is. And they're groomed. They're literally groomed. And it's slowly pulled into this dynamic that feels so intoxicating. It feels so exciting. It's like your favorite uncle, your favorite, whatever it is. And then it starts to cross the sexual line.
Mm.
And children do not know how to initiate sex. It's way over your head. I mean, they have no clue. Um, but this adult starts to do it. The problem is that almost always, I would say 9 times out of 10, it is a positive, pleasurable experience for the child. They are enjoying it. It's not this horrific, horrible thing. So at a certain point, the abuse will either end organically or it will just whatever. Once they realize what had happened to them, it becomes this very conflicting experience because I was abused, yet I feel like I enjoyed the entire thing. That mess is what really stings for
Yeah.
people. And it's super common. It's really, really common.
And I'm willing to bet that that gets all tangled up in their own identity as, let's say,
Hmm.
they're gay. As a gay person, it's like,
Yep.
well, am I gay because of that, or
Hmm.
did I want that, and that was like, how do you entangle that?
So I would say that, I mean, like we think of sexuality as being on a spectrum, right? So the whole thing of like, did someone, I think before people used to really think like, oh, someone must have like flicked a switch and they turned me gay. And we know that's not true now. We know that it's a spectrum. So I mean, I guess the argument now would be like, did they push me more on the spectrum one way or the
Right.
other? But
Yeah.
I would think of it more of this way of someone like hijacked your sexual development, and we don't know what that was exactly, but we can create a sexuality that feels good to you now.
That's so empowering, and that's the benefit, right? Going back to the earlier question of what's the value, is you can take
Mhm.
something that happened. You can't change the past. As I say, we can't go back and change the past, but you can write a new story about it now. going
Hmm.
forward, right? And you don't need to carry that past with you like baggage. It could be something that you liberate yourself from. You don't bury your head in the sand, but you can come to terms with it, where you can at least come to a place of peace or neutrality or something. You don't have to carry.
Yeah, yeah. And when I think that we carry a lot of things with us that just are not true.
Mhm.
It's the same thing of people who grew up with very homophobic family, whatever culture that says that being gay is bad, and that's just
Yeah,
simply not true.
yeah,
That's a belief system that is inaccurate.
yeah,
Some people believe it, but we know that they're wrong. I
yeah.
mean, there's no objective like proof behind that.
What I do with Catholicism is that I kind of take what I like now and I leave the rest. Yeah,
Yeah.
I like this part. I don't like this part, and I don't care.
Hmm.
Like, I don't care if it's a proper or improper. And I think you can do that with anything in your past, or anything that you don't really have a choice over.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing. We used to stigmatize addiction so much more that if this is a choice, why would people, whatever. And now we know that that's not true. This is no one's choice.
So, Michael, what you had said there really surprised me. That most of the time that they find it a pleasurable experience, which is
Yes.
fascinating to me. What might there other like? What are some other surprising misconceptions maybe on the topic of sexual abuse, specifically in the gay population?
I mean, that I think is the biggest one. And it's something that really shames people because
Yeah,
it's like I enjoyed, I mean, adult men that are raped can have a physical, pleasurable response to it too, which can also make it very confusing of like my body responded in a pleasurable way, which we all know this, that you can have like um like erections or whatever it is
yeah,
that you're not consciously choosing. Like our bodies do things all the time that are not our choice. Like I wake up every morning exhausted. I want to be more energized and I'm not, it's not my choice.
right.
Um, but so I think that the idea though that children actually enjoy the experience is just kind of it's like a mind fuck to even think
Yeah,
about. But I think it's important to normalize that there's just a physical process that people go through, and it doesn't mean that they consented to any of it.
right. Even in that hookup scenario that I talked about earlier, where you do the hookup, like eventually, like if it feels good at some point or pleasurable at some point, does that still mean that it's abuse?
I think there can be a really like a gray area for
Yeah,
sure. I think that if you're noticing that you're uncomfortable doing something, then I think you owe it to yourself to get out of it, or you owe it to yourself to pause or take a break or to do figure something out. And if you don't, I think that you're betraying yourself. You're crossing some of your own internal boundaries. Most people I know, and I mean I've been through this too, but when you just kind of go through something I feel like you kind of walk away feeling kind of icky. Like you don't walk away feeling like, oh, great, that was awesome. Like
yeah.
it's not that vibe. Um, so I think I would think of it that way. Um, if you're literally saying no or you're pulling away, another person's pulling you back, then obviously there's something very wrong there.
Yeah. Let's talk about that in the context of like queer spaces such as bathhouses, dark rooms, cruising,
Hmm.
whatnot,
Hmm.
because I frequent those. I enjoy them. I think they're hot and fun and sexy, but I will very easily say no, and I have no problem at all saying that. So again, these are spaces where consent is, at least not in my experience, I've never given consent, not verbally anyway, maybe with my
Hmm.
eyes. But how do
Hmm.
you negotiate that in those spaces?
So I would say, spaces like that, there is this like implicit consent that if you're
Yeah.
there, you're up for it. So that is something to know walking in the door that people may have that assumption. I think most importantly, though, people who have experienced trauma is that you want to be very careful that you don't re-traumatize yourself. Because that's something you want to be very, very mindful of. And I think the problem too is that when people don't get treatment for trauma they've been through, then they go through something else that's kind of similar and it just stings again and it starts to become this like repetition.
Yeah.
So I would say to someone who is curious about doing things like that, like no problem, do what you want, go explore whatever. But if you have any unfinished business that you haven't processed yet, I would do that first.
Yeah, for sure. What I found with the bathhouse situation, and I've been to many of them all over the world, is it will draw people who are more likely to be predatory. I
Yes, I'm
and
glad you
I
said that.
yeah, I'm not a big guy. I'm like 5'8". And so I have found that bigger guys will, in a dark room or something, corner me, push me up against the wall, kind of like put their body literally over me, like so that I can't get out, which can be hot. if I want it to, if I want them. But if it's not, then it's very quickly like, this is not safe. This is very uncomfortable. I need to get out of here. And again, like, it's so easy, I think, for some people to just not want to, not find the words or not know how to say no or fight back or like squeeze out of there.
And can you imagine too, if someone had already been, raped or violated
Right.
in their life, and then they find themselves in that situation? I mean, good God, that would be so traumatizing.
Terrible.
So I think that's why you want to be mindful. I mean, same thing, I can compare these to addiction a lot, 'cause I'm sober, but like if you're sober, like you don't want to go into an arena that's going to be super triggering if you can help it. You want to be mindful of those sorts of things so it doesn't catch you by surprise. So I think it's sort of a similar concept.
What tips would you have for someone who would want to try that out, but let's say they have not been traumatized in the past, they want to go try it out, but maybe, they might be a bit more timid, or they might think they might have a hard time saying no, or they might be scared to get in that situation that I just described.
Well, I think if you're someone who doesn't, if you're not sure if you can speak up for yourself, then you need to figure, I would figure that out first
Yeah.
before you put yourself in a situation where people are being given kind of permission to violate your boundaries that you should, it's going to sound kind of harsh, but I do feel like one of the tasks of being an adult is knowing who you are and standing up for yourself. And if you're not sure about that yet, then I would not put yourself in an arena where you're really going to be tested strongly.
Yeah.
But if you are, then go try it out.
Yeah.
See what you
And,
think.
and I don't want to scare all of our listeners and viewers out there. 95% of the time, a simple no thank you will do the trick for most people. But
Hmm.
there have been, and there are, it's always in those spaces, at least where I found them, people who don't want to hear you, pretend they don't understand you, or just don't care.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think we do have to be, I try, I don't want to be like a cynic, but I think I really do, my philosophy, I really do think most people are good people. I really
Yeah.
do. And
Yeah.
there's like a small percentage of the world that's not. And I think it's important to be aware of that. And you don't want to set yourself up for them to, have bad intentions, put it that way.
So how do you feel about, I mean, my approach is, and this could be very wrong, I'm not sure, but please correct me if it is. But when I go in there, it's like it's a yes until it's a no. Like
Mhm.
if there's nothing, then if I'm there, I'm there for a reason, for me speaking personally here. But it'll be very clear no. If I'm not interested in you, it'll be a very clear no. So I'm kind of open, but I don't always want to have to be like consenting when I'm in a space like that. And a lot of times it's very quiet in a dark room, like things, you aren't really talking anyway. It's not that kind of space. What are your thoughts?
I think it speaks to the type of person and their relationship to their own sexuality. Some people are a little bit more free, like they don't mind people touching them,
Right.
and some people do. I mean, like if you, I'm probably one of these people, but like if I walk through a crowded place and someone just kind of like touches my arm, like I don't like that. Like I'm very clear about who I want to do that and who I don't, and I don't think it's better either way. I just think you have to know who you are.
Yeah, and that's just it. That's what I mean. So, if I was in me in that situation, I'm walking by a big crowd, like at a bar, something, somebody grabs my butt or whatever. I'm like, sure, no problem. Doesn't really bother me, and I will just not say anything until it's a no. So that's what I'm saying. For me, I'm a yes until it's a no, and then that no is a
Mm.
very firm no.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I think I'm a no until it's a yes.
Yeah, right. But even there's just this discussion. So as our listeners are thinking about this, like, which one are you? Right? Where do you fall on that
Mhm.
spectrum? Are you a yes until it's a no, or a no until it's a yes? I know that a lot of abuse could be from your actual partner as well. Speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So if there's any like intimate, we call it intimate partner violence, which can often then lead to sexual abuse. I'll kind of put that in its own category because that's an extremely dangerous situation to be in, and the you have got to get out of it. There, I mean, you don't as a therapist, like there's no work to be done if someone's still in a dynamic like that.
Mm.
Couples therapy is like actually contraindicated because it can just incite more conflict. So, um, if you're, what I'm trying to say is if you're trying to process something traumatic that already happened to you, that's you should be in therapy. If you're still engaged in a dynamic that's dangerous, you're not ready for therapy yet. You have to get yourself safe first. You have to get yourself out of it. And then you can start processing what's happened. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And it kind of speaks to that trust element that you had talked about with childhood. The thing that I'm seeing there is with childhood, you had said the example of it's a family member, a trusted friend or family member. And then with your partner, obviously, again, someone who's trusted. So I think that to me scares me. It's like if that's gonna happen to me, the percentage is pretty good that it's someone that I'm gonna know.
Well, so what you're gonna see, and all human beings do this, straight, gay, whatever, is that we get caught in these repetitions where you know how they always used to say like men will marry their mother or whatever, girls
Yeah.
go with their father. It's true. It doesn't have to be about gender, but you do very, very commonly either marry someone where there's a similar dynamic to one of your parents, or you replicate the relationship you saw with your parents with your partner. It's like just it's just the thing we fall into 90% of the time. Unless we do work on ourselves, we can really get conscious about it. So people who experience abuse as children from one of their parents, it's very easy to pick a partner who's abusive, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's so important to have that awareness because I guess then, you can again, you can kind of look at it and say, oh, here's the programming that I have. Let's see what we can do about that. Let's undo that, right?
I'm sure we've all been through this where we have a friend who is falling in love with someone who's horrible for them.
Yeah.
And we're like, please stop. Like, what are you doing? Like, you're begging them and they don't want to hear it. They
Yeah.
do not want to hear it. They're caught in some sort of repetition where they're just being pulled towards something toxic and you just can't get in the way.
Yeah. As a therapist, what do you do? And speak to the viewers and listeners out there. So kind of speak in layman's terms. How can you help them with that?
I I listened to this podcast recently, and this woman said that it's almost impossible to pull something out of a fairy tale, which I think
Mm,
is so true. My experience as a therapist is that you will get fired very quickly if you try to convince someone that their new love is bad for them. That's not news people want to hear. And I'm pretty like direct, so I'll call it like I see it. But okay, so yeah, I think you have to be bold, you have to be brave, and tell them, lay out your case and be clear about what you think is toxic. If they do not want to hear it,
yeah.
then I think it's tough, but you kind of have to let the car crash happen and be there for them when they're ready to pick up the pieces.
Yeah.
Because if you keep trying, I think they're just going to get rid of you. I can imagine myself doing that when I was younger. Like, you don't want to hear it when you feel like you found the one. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a quote that I love. I'm going to butcher, but it's something like you can't help people who don't want to be helped.
Hmm.
At the end of that, and there has to be like a little sliver. It doesn't have to be a lot, but like sometimes in the back of your head, your friends could be telling you this person's wrong for you, and you might say, no, 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 they're not. But there's a whisper in your intuition, like, oh, maybe there's something there. That's all you need is just a little crack of intuition to explore with someone safe and confidential to like say, okay, wait, maybe there is something here.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, I think there's a reason why every song is about tortured love. It's like love is blindness. It's this intoxicating thing that pulls you in, turns you into a different person, and then drops you on the ground. So
Yeah.
I think it does something to us too.
Let's talk a little bit about the types of therapies that you kind of mentioned at the beginning.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, Give us a little rundown of what they're about, each one of
Yeah,
them.
yeah. So and with trauma, it's so fascinating. So for for a long time, traditional therapy was talk therapy. And the idea was that, and this is still true, that our mind is mostly unconscious and very little of it is conscious awareness. And so what we're trying to do is access the unconscious material by making ourselves more and more self-aware, which is still very, very true and very accurate. And the more you know about yourself, the better you're going to operate in the world, 100%.
Yeah.
But what we've realized, particularly with trauma, is that there's a really strong reaction between the brain and the body that has nothing to do with your cognitive thinking and how rational and smart you are. And I'm sure, I mean, we've all been through this where we know something, but it's still triggering us.
Hmm.
We're aware of something, but it's still upsetting us.
Hmm.
So that's more of a reaction between the brain and the body. So now there are different types of therapy that address that process in particular. Probably the one that's the most well known is EMDR, which that's a whole other podcast to explain that. But it's a way of helping the two hemispheres of the brain communicate in a way to regulate the nervous system. It's very different than the conversation that we're having right now. There's also ketamine assisted psychotherapy, which is being used a lot with trauma as well. That's very different than like a traditional cognitive therapy. Yeah.
What does the ketamine do exactly in a therapeutic sense?
So that one is again we could talk for a long time. The ketamine one is really interesting because it creates like the brain is like kind of like hardwired, if you think of it that way. Ketamine creates this window where it's malleable. or it's actually flexible. And so it kind of creates this space, and then you can do work while you have it. I don't know if you've ever done like a psychedelic drug before, but when
Mm.
you're on it, you literally have a different type of consciousness.
Yeah.
If you can intervene there, you can create change. A lot of people, when they're on a psychedelic, and I've had this experience, you have all these realizations and you think, oh my God, this is going to be me forever. And then it comes and goes and you go right back to who you were before. But when you're on it, it feels so strong.
Mhm.
You go into that window, is like a general way of putting it.
Fascinating. Yeah, I've only
Yeah.
I've only known of ketamine as the party drugs on a dance floor, not in a therapist chair.
It's it's very different. It's much better.
Oh,
A
okay.
lot of people have told me that, like, oh, I've done ketamine on a dance floor. I'm like, this is way it's pure. It's like the real substance. It's not diluted with whatever the hell this is
Yeah,
it's the true medicinal experience.
fascinating. And so that's something that you do yourself.
Yes.
That's
Yes,
awesome.
you can actually be with your client while they're on ketamine and
Yeah.
help them process, and then you do integration work afterwards the next day.
So what would you help a client or patient, I guess for you, a patient with who wants to, let's say, set more firm boundaries or learn how to say no?
So 9 times out of 10, when you have that conversation, is that you're gonna like think of some example in the past, and then go get clear about where they should have set the boundary, and then you're gonna plan for the future. Okay, the next time this comes up, this is what I'm gonna do. And 9 times out of 10, they're gonna fail. The moment's gonna come, they're gonna know they're supposed to do it, and they're gonna choke. So and then you don't want to both feel frustrated and feel like, I would expect that to happen, is what I'm trying to say. So what you want to be very clear about is, in what do they experience in that moment when they're like about to get up to the plate, and then they can't do it. What happens to you? And I would just sort of keep them there until something comes up. Just stay with them in that process, because a lot of people, and I did this too, it's like you are fine through most of the process, but then there's a point where you struggle and you quit, and you want to stay with them in that moment.
Yeah. And that's another reason to work with any professional, doesn't matter really who it would be or what it is, because that accountability, someone to keep you on track, someone to keep you accountable, someone to hold space for you as you go through that shame spiral, like, oh no, I can't do it. Because if you already have a lot of shame, then you
Hmm.
add on to the fact that oh man, I tried again and I failed again. It's really easy if you don't have that support to just go into your own shame spiral again. But when you have someone there, like you just did, who's like, it's a lot to go through that on the first time. You're not going to get it right the first time. That doesn't mean we quit. It means we just try again, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's very often when we're failing, we're used to people giving up on us, or
Mhm.
getting annoyed or frustrated, or that they feel defeated and that we feel defeated, and so we're just both defeated together.
Mhm.
So you don't want to do that.
Yeah.
You want to get curious with them about what's happening.
Yeah. Love it. Good. I hope that there are a lot of people listening out there who, even if it's not necessarily about sexual abuse, but see the benefit of having a therapist or a coach or any kind of professional uh, work through these things, walk them through some of these more difficult scenarios, right?
Yes, I mean, sometimes I think, because I do my ongoing work, of course, with this job, and just I want to be more aware and get better, and I still have tons of growth to, endless things to learn. I think a lot about the progress I've made in therapy, but I also think about the pitfalls, or like the lows that I haven't gone into, because I do therapy. Like,
Hmm.
because I have this practice in my life. I have several practices in my life to sustain my mental health. It's not just about my growth, but it's also about, where would I be without all these things? Like, I probably would suffer a lot more, and I have a lot more lows, and a lot of other stress that would come up for me. So
Yeah, this resilience is what I would call it. Yeah, right. Like it doesn't mean that challenging things don't happen. Doesn't mean you don't face adversity. It just means that you feel a little bit better equipped when they do come up because it's inevitable that these things are going to come up, right?
yes. Yeah, I think sometimes people go to therapy like to fix something and be done with it. And I've done that too. I get that. But I really see, the more that I do this work, but also my own work, I really see the value of the maintenance.
Hmm.
That when I like when I stumble, I feel like I don't stumble as much.
Hmm.
Or not, I don't think, I know I don't stumble as much.
Yeah, yeah, I feel you on that. And I mean, therapists have therapists, coaches have coaches,
Mm-hmm.
and it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that like we have it all figured out by any means. I have yet to meet anyone who works in this field that has it all figured out or claims
If
to.
you meet someone who tells you they have it all figured out, run for your life.
Right. I
Run
agree.
away.
Yeah. And where can people find you if they do want to find you?
Yeah. So I practice in person in West Hollywood, where my office is, but I'm licensed in California, so I work with people remotely throughout the state. Some people live, people in the Bay Area, or some people aren't. If you're in a major city, you can find a gay therapist pretty easily, like New York, LA, whatever. But if you're in a smaller town, there's very few to be had. So remotely throughout California, and then yeah, I've got my website, which is my name, and I have a very unusual last name. So if you look me up, you're going to find me.
Say it for us.
Pezzullo.
So, and I said in the Italian way,
I know
Pezzullo.
yours is the right way.
Yes, yes. And mine's Diorio. So we're both Michaels and we're both Italian. So, and we're both
And
gay.
you're Neapolitan too, right? Or Sicilian?
No, Pugliese and Abruzzese.
Okay.
Yeah. So
That's what I'm Neapolitan and Sicilian. I just assumed you were too.
South,
South.
the general South. Okay, Michael, any last words before we wrap this up for our audience?
Um, I guess just the last thing I would say is that anyone who has gone through this or is unsure about seeking help, that it's okay. It's okay to do that. And also to choose your moment. If now is not your moment to dig in, that's okay too. You can wait until you're ready.
When we've had these episodes, I've done episodes on spiritual abuse, religious trauma, other sexual trauma. The feedback that we get is always like, I listened to it once, I stopped it 5 minutes in because it was too uncomfortable. I listened to it again a few weeks later, and then I listened to it again 4 months later, and then eventually, like I said, that little silent or that little quiet voice within, they said, okay, something needs to be done. I contacted my doctor, I contacted the therapist, whatever that is.
And I think too, back when I was 18 and I first started to struggle with mental health and drinking and stuff, and I was curious about help, and I had no clue what that was. That podcasts were not like they are now,
Um,
but these things are so valuable because it's such a big step to call a therapist to do those things, but to listen to a podcast, it's a much more passive way to get curious. I think it's
yeah.
so valuable.
All right, Michael. Well, thank you for being on the episode today. Thank you for the topic idea. This was Michael's idea. And I'm really happy that we got a chance to talk about this. And I do hope that our viewers and listeners out there got something out of it. I'm sure they did. If you want to contact Michael, I will put his information in the show notes. And please do give him an email or visit his website. Are you also on Instagram, Michael?
I am, but website's better.
Website. Okay. Find him
Yeah,
on his website.
yeah.
All right.
More
Thank you,
professional.
everyone. And we'll see you next Thursday. Bye bye.